At around 10 at night on December 4th, 2000, the research vessel Atlantis was rolling on a swell roughly 1,500 miles off the east coast of the United States, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, when a submersible crew descending an underwater mountain called the Atlantis Massif saw something in their lights that made absolutely no sense. The dive that night was part of a routine geological survey, using the deep submergence vehicle Alvin and a remotely operated companion vehicle, and nobody involved expected to find anything beyond ordinary seafloor rock. Samples. Instead, rising out of the seafloor darkness were ghostly white towers, dozens of them, some standing as tall as a 15-story building, glowing pale in the submersible's floodlights like the ruins of an abandoned city. Geologist Deborah Kelly, one of the scientists aboard, would later describe the moment of realizing what they were actually looking at as one of the most disorienting experiences of her career. Watching an entire unknown ecosystem materialize out of total blackness on a routine survey dive nobody had prepared for. Nobody on that expedition had been looking for this. They weren't even searching for hydrothermal vents that night. What they'd stumbled onto didn't fit any model geologists had for how the deep ocean was supposed to work, and scientists have spent the 25 years since then trying to fully understand what they actually found. They named it the Lost City, and it remains one of the strangest, most genuinely important discoveries in the history of ocean science, precisely because nothing about it should exist according to what researchers thought they understood about deep sea vents at the time. Every hydrothermal vent field known before that night worked the same basic way. Seawater seeps down through cracks near an active volcanic ridge, gets superheated by magma close to the surface, and blasts back out as scalding, mineral-rich water that builds dark, jagged chimneys. Called black smokers, often exceeding 350 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Lost City breaks that entire model. It sits well away from any volcanic spreading center, on an underwater mountain made of mantle rock that's been pushed up and exposed directly to seawater. There's no magma involved at all. Instead, the rock itself reacts chemically with seawater in a process called serpentinization, a slow, heat-producing chemical reaction that needs no volcanic fire whatsoever, and that reaction alone is enough to drive vents pushing out. Fluid at a much gentler 60 to 90 degrees Celsius, building soft, pale carbonate towers instead of black smoker chimneys. The tallest structure at the site, nicknamed Poseidon, stands about 60 meters high, nearly the height of a 20-story building, and researchers estimate the field has likely been continuously active for more than 120,000 years, making it one of the longest lived hydrothermal systems ever discovered anywhere on the planet, volcanic or not. Here's what makes Lost City matter far beyond its strange geology, though, and why NASA and astrobiologists specifically care about a set of underwater towers found on an obscure ridge in the middle of the Atlantic. The chemical reaction powering these vents produces hydrogen and methane as simple byproducts, molecules that happen to be exactly the kind of basic chemical building blocks life needs to get started, generated here without sunlight, without photosynthesis, and without any volcanic heat source at all, just rock-meeting water in the crushing dark. Microbial communities at Lost City survive entirely on that chemistry, thriving in extremely alkaline fluid with a pH between 9 and 11, the kind of environment that would be caustic to most life on the surface. Because this exact kind of serpentinization reaction doesn't require a planet with active volcanism or a molten core, the way black smoker vents do, only rock, water, and time. Scientists studying Lost City increasingly treat it as one of the strongest real-world models for how life might have first ignited on early Earth, and more provocatively, for where it might currently be quietly happening on icy moons like Europa. In Enceladus, worlds with rocky cores and oceans of liquid water sealed away from sunlight under miles of ice, in conditions that look remarkably like what a submersible crew stumbled onto by accident one December night in the middle of the Atlantic. If Lost City shows the Atlantic can quietly build cathedral-sized towers where nobody expected geology to behave that way, a very different discovery, much closer to the surface of public consciousness, shows the same ocean can build something considerably more sinister only a few thousand feet down. In 2014, a research team aboard the exploration vessel Nautilus, using a remotely operated submersible called Hercules, was surveying cold seeps in the Gulf of Mexico, part of the same Atlantic Ocean basin, when they found a nearly perfect circular pool sitting on the seafloor itself, roughly 100 feet, around and about 12 feet deep, with a rim rising sharply enough that it looked, in the researchers' own words caught on the expedition's live feed, eerily like the shoreline of an actual lake sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Except this lake wasn't made of ordinary seawater. It was brine, water roughly 4 to 5 times saltier than the ocean surrounding it, dense enough that it refuses to mix with the seawater above it, sitting in its own separate, self-contained pool nearly a kilometer beneath the surface. The researchers nicknamed it the hot tub of despair, And once the cameras got close enough to see clearly why, the name stuck permanently. Scattered along the pool's rim and drifting in its depths were the preserved corpses of crabs and amphipods, some of them frozen in place upside down, pickled rather than decomposed, because the brine is so hostile to bacterial decay that anything unlucky enough to wander in essentially never breaks down at all. One of the marine chemists on the expedition, watching the footage in real time, remarked that these creatures either genuinely didn't like being in that fluid, or, only half joking, that they'd simply come there to die. Layered through the brine are high concentrations of methane and hydrogen sulfide, gases that make the pool toxic to nearly any animal with lungs or gills as we'd recognize them, sourced from ancient salt deposits left behind roughly 160 million years ago, when the Gulf of Mexico was a shallow, evaporating sea that dried out and buried thick layers of salt beneath what later became the modern ocean floor. Shifting slabs of that ancient buried salt now crack and let concentrated brine bleed back up onto the seafloor today, forming a pool of genuinely liquid death sitting quietly inside one of the busiest, most heavily fished, most extensively drilled bodies of water on Earth. And yet, right at the very edge of that lethal pool, in a band just a few feet wide, something else is happening that's almost the opposite of despair. Colonies of mussels and tube worms cling to the pool's rim in genuinely thriving numbers, not merely surviving there, but actively depending on the same toxic chemistry that kills everything unlucky enough to fall in. These animals host chemosynthetic bacteria inside their own tissue, microbes capable of converting the pool's hydrogen sulfide and methane directly into usable energy, the same basic biochemical trick that lets life survive around volcanic hydrothermal vents without ever needing a single photon of sunlight. Marine biologist Eric Cordes, who helped study the site, has pointed out that scientists have actually known brine pools exist somewhere in the ocean for roughly 30 years, but that this particular one stood out as spectacular, specifically because of how developed and visibly thriving its surrounding ecosystem turned out to be compared to other known examples, including a separate brine pool found in the Mediterranean that lacks anything like the same dense fringe of life. Researchers studying the site have specifically pointed to it as a working model for understanding what kind of biology might be possible inside other completely sunless oceans in our solar system, sealed beneath ice on distant moons, using this one patch of Gulf of Mexico seafloor as a genuine physicae. Stand-in for environments we currently can't visit ourselves, and because the extreme salt concentration prevents normal decomposition entirely, researchers estimate some of the pickled crab corpses resting along the pool's floor could realistically have been sitting there, perfectly preserved and completely undisturbed, for decades before any camera ever caught sight of them. The Atlantic hides one more category of shouldn't exist, entirely at the opposite end of the size spectrum from towering vent chimneys and 40-foot squid, and it's arguably the strangest of them all precisely because of how simple the organism actually is. Scattered across the floor of deep Atlantic trenches, including sites researchers have surveyed in the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean at over 8,300 meters down, scientists have found organisms called xenophyophories, single-celled amoeba-like creatures that, despite being made of just one cell, can grow to the size of a small dinner plate, some specimens measuring 20 centimeters or more across. That's a genuinely staggering scale mismatch by the normal rules of biology. A single cell is supposed to be microscopic, limited by the basic physics of how efficiently a cell membrane can move nutrients and waste in and out of itself as it grows larger. Xenophyophories appear to sidestep that limitation by building elaborate branching shells out of cemented sediment particles and mineral crystals, structures that let a single giant cell organize its internal processes across a surprisingly large physical footprint, without ever dividing into the specialized multicellular tissues every other large organism on Earth relies on to function at that size. Researchers studying the deep trenches of the Atlantic have found these creatures acting as tiny reefs in their own right, providing physical structure that shelters other smaller organisms in the sediment around them, an entire miniature ecosystem built on the back of something that, on paper, is barely more complex than a single human skin cell, thriving in some of the highest pressure, lowest food environments anywhere on the planet. The Atlantic has kept quietly surprising researchers well beyond these two isolated dramatic sites too, sometimes on a scale that's much harder to picture, precisely because it isn't a single dramatic pool or tower, it's spread out across an entire coastline. In 2014, a team led by geologist Adam Skark published findings in the journal Nature Geoscience describing something researchers genuinely hadn't expected to find at all: hundreds of methane seeps quietly bubbling up from the seafloor along the entire United States east coast, clustered between North Carolina's Cape Hatteras and George Bank off Massachusetts. Methane seeps weren't a surprise in themselves. They're common in places like the Gulf of Mexico, sitting atop deep oil and gas reservoirs, or along the tectonically active west coast, where shifting fault lines create natural pathways for gas to escape. What genuinely startled researchers was finding roughly 550 seeps in a completely different kind of setting, a so-called passive margin, a stretch of coastline with no significant fault activity, no volcanic ridge nearby, nothing in the existing geological models that predicted seepage on anything like this scale should be happening there at all. Follow-up surveys using higher resolution sonar have only expanded that original number since, with more recent combined mapping, identifying well over 1,000 individual gas flare sites, as once duplicate readings were filtered out, revealing an entire hidden landscape of continuously bubbling seafloor stretching along thousands of kilometers of American coastline that had simply never been mapped in this kind of detail before. Carolyn Ruppel, a hydrate specialist involved in the research, has pointed out that the fate of the released gas itself remains an open question, since current evidence suggests most of it is likely dissolving into the surrounding water column and being consumed by microbes before ever reaching the surface, rather than escaping directly into the atmosphere. Though scientists are careful to note, this picture could shift as warming continues and as more of these seeps are studied in detail over time. Around each individual seep, scientists have also found entire small ecosystems that have adapted specifically to feed on the escaping gas. Deep-sea mussels belonging to a species called Bathymodiolus childressi, dominating the seafloor around seeps north of Cape Hatteras, and evidence that at least some seeps may function as important reproductive grounds for commercially valuable deep-sea red crab populations, meaning this accidentally discovered, previously invisible seep network may already be quietly propping up part of a real, valuable American fishery without anyone having realized it until sonar equipment finally caught up with what was actually happening on the seafloor. Even the animals that have made the Atlantic famous in popular imagination for centuries turned out to be hiding secrets that took modern technology far longer to crack than almost anyone expected. Giant squid have been the subject of sailors' legends since at least the writings of Aristotle and Pliny the Elder, described across centuries of maritime folklore as ship-swallowing monsters lurking in the deep, feeding directly into legends like the Kraken that Scandinavian sailors swore attacked ships in the North Atlantic for generations, for the entirety of recorded human history. Every single thing we knew about the actual living animal came from corpses that had washed ashore or floated to the surface already dead, or from mangled remains recovered from the stomachs of sperm whales, the giant squid's one confirmed natural predator, because nobody had ever managed to film or observe a live giant squid behaving naturally in its own habitat. Zoologist Clyde Roper, long considered the world's foremost authority on the species, spent decades of his career chasing exactly this goal and never personally achieved it, working almost entirely from carcasses and fragments, the scientific equivalent of trying to understand a living person by only ever examining photographs of their skeleton. That finally changed in 2012, when marine biologist Edith Witter and her colleagues used a specially designed camera system called Medusa, built specifically to avoid scaring deep-sea creatures away with harsh white light off the coast of Japan. Instead of bright lights, Medusa uses a dim red glow invisible to most deep sea eyes, paired with an electronic lure mimicking the bioluminescent flashing pattern of a distressed jellyfish, a visual dinner bell aimed squarely at whatever predator might be listening in the dark. It worked. For the very first time in recorded human history, a live giant squid was filmed behaving naturally in the environment it actually lives in, roughly 2,500 feet down, in near total darkness. Then, in June of 2019, on a no-AA-funded expedition, studying the Gulf of Mexico's so-called Midnight Zone, roughly 100 miles southeast of New Orleans, the same Medusa system caught something even more specifically significant: the first giant squid ever filmed alive in United States waters, anywhere in the Atlantic basin at all. Researcher Nathan Robinson was reviewing hours of footage aboard the ship when a thin, undulating arm crept into frame, split suddenly into a full spray of tentacles, and revealed an actual living giant squid attacking the electronic lure before vanishing back into the darkness as abruptly as it had appeared. The crew estimated the animal at somewhere between 10 and 12 feet long, genuinely enormous, but almost certainly a juvenile compared to the largest specimens Smithsonian researchers have measured from stranded carcasses, some pushing past 40 feet in total length. Witter herself, who'd already made history once off Japan 7 years earlier, described watching the footage back as an almost overwhelming sense of vindication after years spent trying to build. Technology capable of finally observing an animal humans had been telling stories about and misunderstanding almost entirely for literally thousands of years. What ties Lost City, the hot tub of despair, the hidden seep fields off the east coast, and a sea monster hiding in plain sight for millennia together isn't coincidence. It's a pattern worth sitting with for a moment. because it says something genuinely important about how much confidence anyone should have in claims about what the ocean does or doesn't contain. Every single one of these discoveries directly contradicted an existing scientific assumption. At the moment it was found, hydrothermal vents were supposed to need volcanic heat, until Lost City showed an entirely separate chemical pathway could build even taller structures without a single drop of magma. Passive, tectonically quiet coastlines were assumed to be geologically boring compared to volcanic margins, until sonar revealed over 1,000 seeps quietly bubbling along one of the most heavily studied coastlines on the planet, and an animal genuinely large enough to leave 40-foot carcasses on beaches for centuries still took until 2012 to be filmed alive even once, because the technology needed to actually watch it, rather than simply find its corpse. Quite literally, it didn't exist until scientists specifically built tools designed around not frightening it away with light. That last point deserves real emphasis because it reframes what these discoveries actually mean for anyone tempted to reach for sea monsters, lost civilizations, or ancient aliens to explain why the ocean keeps producing things that feel impossible. The truth is almost more unsettling in its plainness. These things weren't secrets deliberately hidden by any government, institution, or ancient intelligence. They were simply unobserved, sitting in one of the least explored environments accessible to humans on this entire planet, waiting for someone to build the right piece of equipment, pointed in the right direction, and happened to be looking at the right moment. More than 80% of the world's ocean remains, completely unmapped and unexplored at any real level of detail even now, a genuinely staggering gap in basic human knowledge about our own planet that's easy to lose sight of, given how thoroughly mapped the ocean's surface looks on any satellite image. We know the surface topography of Mars and the Moon in sharper detail than we know our own seafloor, simply because water is so much harder to see through than empty space, and a spacecraft orbiting overhead can map an airless world in a single pass, in a way no ship or satellite can currently do for anything hidden beneath several kilometers of seawater. International efforts like the Seabed 2030 project are working to close that gap, aiming to produce a complete, high-resolution map of the entire ocean floor by the end of this decade, a genuinely ambitious goal that would still only tell us where the mountains, trenches, and ridges are, not what's actually living, bubbling, or glowing on top of them, which is exactly the kind of detail that took a wrong turn on a routine dive, a lucky sonar pass, or a specially built red light camera to actually reveal in each of the cases we've just gone through. So, when you hear that scientists found something in the Atlantic that shouldn't exist, the honest, far more interesting answer isn't that reality got bent or that some ancient system was finally decoded. It's that our working models of the ocean were built on an almost absurdly small sample of direct observation, and every single expedition that actually goes looking, with a submersible, a sonar array, or a carefully engineered camera rig built specifically not to scare its subject away, keeps discovering that the real Atlantic was simply stranger than the incomplete map anyone had drawn of it so far. Consider the actual logistics involved in each of these 4 discoveries. Finding Lost. City required a crude submersible descending nearly a kilometer into total darkness on a dive nobody had planned around finding it. Finding the Hot Tub of Despair required a remotely operated vehicle piloted from a ship on the surface, threading a path through nearly 1,000 meters of water to a single specific coordinate. Mapping the East Coast seep field required years of dedicated multi-beam sonar surveying across thousands of kilometers of coastline before a clear pattern even emerged from the noise. And filming a giant squid alive required inventing an entirely new category of camera technology, one patient enough to sit motionless in the dark for hours at a time, specifically because every previous attempt using conventional lighting had almost certainly been scaring the animal away before anyone even realized it was there. None of these discoveries were accidents of luck alone. Each one required someone willing to build better tools, ask a more specific question, and spend years in genuinely uncomfortable, difficult conditions, simply to see what was already sitting there, waiting. 60-meter carbonate towers glowing in total darkness. A lake of liquid death with a visible shoreline sitting a kilometer underwater, ringed by the one form of life specifically built to feed on what kills everything else that touches it. 1,000+ points along the American coastline where the seafloor has apparently been quietly exhaling methane for who knows how long, undetected until someone finally pointed the right sonar at the right patch of continental shelf. A single-cell organism large enough to see without a microscope, building its own mineral shell on the floor of the deepest trench in the entire ocean. And a genuine sea monster, real, physically documented, corpses washing up on beaches for centuries, that still took until 2012 for a single living human being to actually watch it move. None of that needed to be invented. None of it required a leaked tablet, a suppressed institution, or a secret only a handful of insiders were ever allowed to see. It just required someone willing to go look, in a place that's genuinely still, even now, one of the last true frontiers of discovery left anywhere on Earth. If you want to see where scientists are actually looking next, expeditions are still actively searching the mid-Atlantic ridge for other lost city-style vent fields, having found only a small handful of comparable sites anywhere on the planet since that first December night in 2000, and researchers are still working through the newly expanded East Coast seep data to figure out exactly how much methane these fields might eventually release as ocean temperatures continue climbing. Let me know in the comments which of these 4 finds you'd never actually heard of before today. And subscribe if you want more of the real ocean discoveries that keep proving the genuine unknown is always stranger and considerably better documented than anything anyone needs to make up about it.